Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank robbery of 2007. The sun rose over the Karada district of Baghdad on the morning of July 11, 2007, with a relentless, golden intensity. It was a city that rarely knew true silence, yet in the early hours of that Wednesday, a peculiar, heavy stillness seemed to settle over the commercial streets. The air was already thick and humid, carrying the scent of parched earth, exhaust fumes, and the sweet, lingering aroma of jasmine from hidden gardens. Baghdad was a place of high walls and ancient dust, a city caught in the middle of a long and weary struggle, yet life continued with a rhythmic, stubborn persistence. On this particular morning, as the shadows began to shorten against the sun-bleached pavement, the world was waking up. Shopkeepers were rolling up their corrugated metal shutters with a rhythmic, clattering sound, and the distant thrum of engines provided a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in the soles of one's feet. Amidst this awakening, the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank stood as a bastion of commerce, its facade a blend of modern ambition and the grit of a city under pressure. It was a private institution, a place where the physical reality of wealth was stored in the form of cold, hard currency. But as the clock ticked toward 8 in the morning, the routine of the day was about to be shattered by a void so large it would leave the entire world in disbelief. Imagine the walk toward the bank. The ground beneath your shoes is uneven, the concrete cracked by years of heat and the weight of history. As the employees arrived, they moved with the slow, deliberate pace of those who know the heat will only intensify. They carried with them the small rituals of the morning, the anticipation of a cup of strong tea, the quiet murmurs of greeting to colleagues. The street was becoming crowded, but as they approached the entrance of the bank, something felt fundamentally wrong. Usually, the 3 security guards who lived on the premises would be visible, perhaps sitting just inside the glass, their presence a silent assurance of order. These were men who didn't just work at the bank. They slept there, their lives entwined with the safety of the vault. But this morning, there was no shadow moving behind the glass. There was no sound of a lock being turned from the inside to welcome the staff. One of the managers reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door, expecting the resistance of a deadbolt. Instead, the handle turned with a smooth, sickening ease. The door didn't just open. It swung inward, revealing a lobby that was swallowed by a deep, unnatural quiet. The cool air from the air conditioning hit their skin, but it brought no comfort. It felt stale, as if the room had been holding its breath for hours. The floor was a polished marble that reflected the dim light, and every footstep echoed with a sharp, lonely, hollow sound. There was no one behind the counters, no one in the guard station, only the hum of the cooling system and the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. The staff moved deeper into the building, their movements becoming hesitant, as if they were intruding on a tomb. They passed the desks where papers were neatly stacked, where pens lay exactly where they had been left the night before. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken glass, no overturned chairs, no splintered wood. The interior of the bank was a masterpiece of order, which only served to make the absence of life more terrifying. They reached the area where the security guards typically rested. The small, makeshift beds were still there, the blankets rumpled as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. But the pillows were cold. The small personal items, a watch, a pack of cigarettes, were gone. The silence in this back room was different. It was thick with the realization that the protectors had become the ghosts. The light in the hallway flickered once, twice, casting long, dancing shadows against the beige walls. The managers continued toward the heart of the institution, their hearts pounding against their ribs like trapped birds. Every corner they turned revealed another empty space. The smell of the bank was a mixture of ozone, old paper, and the metallic tang of the massive safe deposit boxes. It was a smell of security and permanence, but as they neared the vault, That scent seemed to thin out, replaced by a draft of moving air that shouldn't have been there. When they finally reached the vault, the sight was enough to make the breath catch in their throats. The massive, reinforced steel door, a marvel of engineering designed to withstand fire and force, stood wide open. It didn't just sit ajar. It was swung back to its fullest extent, inviting the eye into the darkness within. The vault was a cavern of concrete and steel, usually filled to the ceiling with the weight of hundreds of millions of dollars. But as the managers stepped over the threshold, they found themselves standing in a hollow shell. The shelves were bare. The floor, which should have been cluttered with the overflow of currency, was clean. It was as if the money had simply evaporated into the morning mist. The scale of the void was staggering. They were looking at the absence of 282 million US dollars. In that moment, the physical reality of such a number is impossible to grasp. It is not just paper. It is thousands of pounds of weight. A single $1 million in $100 bills weighs over 20 pounds. To move 282 million would require the transport of more than 6,000 pounds of cash. That is over 3 tons of paper, ink, and history. The guards were gone, the money was gone, and the bank was left with nothing but the cooling air and the realization that one of the largest heists in human history had just occurred without a single shot being fired. The morning sun continued to rise outside, oblivious to the fact that the vault was now just an empty room, a silent witness to a disappearance that defied all logic. The silence inside the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank was not the empty silence of a building at rest. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press against the very walls of the vault. In the wake of the discovery, the air felt thick with the ghost of a presence that had only recently departed. At the main security desk, the monitors flickered with the steady, grainy feed of empty hallways and shadowed corners, their low hum the only pulse left in the room. On the desk sat 3 small glasses of tea, their glass surfaces clouded with a thin, sticky residue where the steam had once risen. The liquid inside was dark and cold, a testament to a ritual interrupted, or perhaps a ritual completed with chilling precision. There were no signs of a struggle here. No chairs were overturned, no papers were scattered across the floor in a desperate scramble, and no alarms had ever pierced the thick night air of the Karada district. It was as if the 3 men assigned to protect this fortress had simply stepped out of their skins and dissolved into the humid darkness of the Baghdad night. To understand the vanishing of these 3 guards, one must first imagine the world they inhabited during those long, sweltering hours of July 11, 2007. These were men who had been vetted, men who had been entrusted with the keys to one of the most significant private financial caches in a city that was, at the time, a labyrinth of checkpoints and shadows. They were familiar faces to the bank staff, figures who moved through the corridors with the quiet confidence of people who knew every creak of the floorboards and every blind spot of the security cameras. Their backgrounds were typical of the era, men looking for a steady wage in a landscape of uncertainty. Yet, beneath the veneer of the professional uniform, something else was brewing. Investigators would later wonder about the whispers in the tea houses, the late-night meetings in the narrow alleys of Baghdad, and the invisible threads that connected these protectors to the powerful militias that ruled the streets once the sun went down. They were the ultimate insiders, the keepers of the gate who knew exactly when the gate was most vulnerable. Outside the bank, the Karada neighborhood was a tapestry of sensory contradictions. The scent of jasmine from hidden gardens mingled with the acrid smell of diesel, exhaust from the thousands of private generators that buzzed like angry hornets, providing a mechanical soundtrack to the city's restless sleep. The palm trees stood tall and motionless against the deep indigo sky, their fronds like jagged fingers reaching toward a moon that offered little light. Every few blocks, the orange glow of a checkpoint fire would illuminate the tired faces of young soldiers, their rifles slung low. This was the environment the guards had to navigate. They weren't just walking away from a job. They were embarking on a journey through a war-torn urban maze with a cargo so massive it defied imagination. The sheer logistics of their task should have made it impossible. We are talking about $282 million in United States currency, accompanied by over 200 million Iraqi dinars. This was not a handful of diamonds tucked into a pocket or a few gold bars hidden in a waistband. This was thousands of pounds of paper, a physical mountain of wealth that required more than just greed to move. It required a fleet of vehicles and a small army of help. Imagine the physical sensation of that night. The sound of heavy nylon bags dragging across the polished marble, a low, rasping noise that must have echoed through the empty lobby like the breath of a giant. The guards would have felt the weight in their shoulders and the strain in their backs as they hauled bag after bag of $100 bills toward the exit. The ink of so much fresh currency has a specific, metallic smell, a scent of copper and old linen that fills the nose and clings to the clothes. They would have moved in a coordinated dance, perhaps barely speaking, their communication reduced to nods and gestures in the dim light of the bank's emergency lamps. Each time they stepped out the front door, the heat of the Iraqi night would have hit them like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled stillness of the vault. They were crossing a threshold from which there was no return. With every bag loaded into the waiting trucks, their old lives were being erased, replaced by the terrifying and exhilarating reality of becoming the most wanted men in the country. When the morning staff arrived at the bank at 8 a.m., they found the front doors not just unlocked, but standing slightly ajar, as if the building were exhaling. The morning sun was already beginning to bake the pavement, casting long, sharp shadows across the entrance. Inside, the lack of noise was the first alarm. There was no greeting from the night shift, no sound of the television in the break room, no footsteps. As the employees moved deeper into the building, the realization began to dawn with the cold clarity of a winter spring. The guards were gone. Their uniforms, perhaps discarded or simply hidden under the cover of civilian clothes, were nowhere to be seen. More importantly, the vault, that steel-reinforced sanctuary of capital, was an empty shell. The three men had vanished so completely that it felt as if they had never existed at all. They had navigated through the most dangerous city on Earth, passed through numerous armed checkpoints, and disappeared into a sea of millions of displaced souls without firing a single shot. The vanishing of the guards was the final piece of the heist's opening act, a performance of absolute silence that left the world wondering how such a massive presence could simply turn into a ghost. The air in Baghdad during the month of July in 2007 was not merely a temperature. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest, tasting of parched earth and the sharp, oily exhaust of idling diesel generators. In the Karada district, where the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank sat as a fortress of stone and secrets, the sun was a relentless, white-hot eye that bleached the world of its color. By high noon, the heat would shimmer off the asphalt in transparent waves, distorting the sight of the concrete blast walls that lined the streets like gray, jagged ribs. This was a city that existed in a state of perpetual, vibrating tension. The silence of the morning was never truly quiet. It was filled with the low-frequency hum of military aircraft circling thousands of feet above, the distant, muffled thump of mortar fire that had become as routine as a heartbeat, and the rhythmic clicking of ceiling fans that struggled to move the stagnant, dusty air inside the bank's lobby. The Karada district was a labyrinth of commercial life and residential anxiety, a place where people lived in the narrow spaces between checkpoints and uncertainty. To understand how nearly $300 million could simply vanish into the ether, one must first feel the suffocating atmosphere of a city where the very concept of order had become a fragile, fraying thread. The instability of 2007 was a perfect, dark storm. Iraq was caught in the throes of a civil war that pitted neighbor against neighbor, and the streets were a patchwork of territories controlled by various sectarian militias. The government was a collection of high-walled compounds, and the police were often spread so thin that their authority stopped at the end of their own rifles. This chaos reached into every corner of life, but it was particularly visible in the crumbling infrastructure of the city. Electricity was a luxury that arrived in short, unpredictable bursts. When the power grid failed, as it did several times a day, the hum of the city would change. The heavy silence that followed the loss of electricity was quickly replaced by the roar of private generators, coughing out clouds of blue smoke. Inside the Dar Es Salaam Bank, these power cuts meant that the modern world was often just a flickering memory. The surveillance cameras, those small, unblinking glass eyes mounted in the corners of the high ceilings, were more often dead than alive. Without a steady flow of current, the screens in the security office would fade to a dull, static gray, leaving the hallways and the vault entrance swallowed in deep, velvety shadows. In a city where the digital world had failed, the bank was forced to rely on the most ancient form of security, the human eye and the weight of a heavy iron key. Because the electronic banking systems of the West had not yet taken root in this war-torn soil, Iraq in 2007 was a society of physical currency. It was a world of paper and ink, of heavy canvas bags and leather satchels. Billions of American dollars had been flown into the country in massive, shrink-wrapped pallets, distributed to private banks to fuel reconstruction and trade. The Dar Es Salaam Bank was not the largest institution in the country, yet its vault was filled with a staggering amount of liquid wealth. There were no digital transfers to track, no lines of code that could be frozen by a central authority. There was only the cold, hard reality of $100 bills stacked high in the darkness. This mountain of cash sat in a building protected by men who lived on the premises, men who breathed the same dust and felt the same heat as the millions of struggling souls outside. The 3 guards who were tasked with watching over this fortune were more than just employees. They were the sole witnesses to the vault's contents. They slept in a small room within the bank, their presence a constant, low-level reassurance to the managers. But in a city where the lines between the law and the militias were blurred, trust was a commodity even more volatile than the currency they guarded. The shadows in the corners of the bank weren't just a lack of light. They were a lack of oversight, a void where the traditional rules of finance had been replaced by the desperate logic of survival. To move through Baghdad in 2007 was to navigate a gauntlet of checkpoints. Every few blocks, soldiers or militiamen stood behind sandbags, checking identification and searching trunks for the ingredients of tragedy. Yet, for those with the right connections, these barriers were not walls, but gates that could be opened with a word or a bribe. This environment provided a unique advantage to anyone bold enough to dream of a heist. The chaos of the city was a shield. If a vehicle filled with cash were to move through the streets under the cover of a militia's protection, it would be invisible to the official authorities. The lack of functional surveillance meant that once the guards stepped out of the bank's front doors, they would be swallowed by a city of 6 million people, all of whom were hiding something. The air in Karata that night was thick with the smell of jasmine and burning trash, a sweet and bitter mix that hung low in the humid darkness. The streetlights were dark, and the only movement came from the stray dogs that prowled the alleys. In this environment, the bank was a lonely island of immense value, and the 3 guards were the only ones who held the map. They knew that the cameras were blind. They knew that the police were miles away, dealing with the latest explosion. And they knew that in the heart of a turmoil-stricken city, a fortune of $282 million was waiting for someone to simply walk out the door with it. The iron door of the vault yielded with a heavy, metallic sigh, revealing a sight that few human eyes have ever witnessed outside of a mint. Inside the cool, stagnant air of the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank, the sheer physical presence of $282 million in United States currency was not just a number on a ledger. It was a mountain of paper that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Imagine, if you will, the smell of that much money. It is not the scent of wealth we imagine in movies, but rather the overwhelming, clinical aroma of ink, the slightly sour tang of linen cotton paper, and the metallic dust of thousands of hands that had touched these bills before they were sequestered here. The stacks of $100 bills were bundled in tight, plastic-wrapped bricks, each containing $10,000. To the three guards standing in the dim light, these bricks were the building blocks of a new life, but collectively, they represented a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. $1 million in $100 bills weighs approximately 22 pounds. Multiply that by 282, and you are no longer looking at something you can simply carry away in a few duffel bags. You are looking at over 6,000 pounds of paper. 3 tons of concentrated value, sitting silently in the dark, waiting to be moved through a city that never truly sleeps. The guards began the back-breaking labor of the heist, their breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts as they hoisted the canvas sacks. Each bag, stuffed to the point of tearing, carried a weight that strained the fibers of their muscles and the seams of the fabric. The sound was rhythmic and heavy. The dull thud of a sack hitting the floor, the rough slide of canvas against the polished stone of the bank lobby, and the low, urgent whispers of men who knew that every second spent in this building was a second closer to discovery. The heat of the Baghdad night, even in the early hours of the morning in July of 2007, pressed against the windows like a physical hand. Sweat slicked their palms, making the plastic wrapping of the money bricks difficult to grip. They worked in a focused, desperate silence. To move 3 tons of cash is to perform a feat of manual labor that defies the glamour of a typical robbery. It is a slow, grueling process of hauling, stacking, and lifting. They were not just thieves in this moment. They were stevedores of a green-inked cargo, navigating the narrow corridors of the bank with the cautious steps of men carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Outside, the city of Baghdad was a tapestry of shadows and flickering lights, but inside these walls, the only world that existed was the cold, hard reality of the weight. In the narrow alleyway behind the bank, the transport vehicles waited, their engines idling with a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very bones of the guards. These were not specialized armored cars, but ordinary vehicles chosen for their ability to blend into the chaotic traffic of the Karata district. As the first heavy bags were tossed into the back, the suspension of the lead vehicle groaned, the metal springs compressing under the sudden influx of weight. It is a detail often overlooked, the physics of a heist. To carry $282 million, you need more than just space. You need the structural integrity to support 3 tons of dead weight. If you were to stack all that cash in one place, it would occupy the volume of roughly 35 household washing machines. It is a massive, ungainly pile of paper that does not sit still. As they filled the vehicles, the floorboards sagged. The tires flattened slightly against the pavement, their rubber sighing under the burden. The guards had to coordinate the distribution of the money carefully, ensuring that no single vehicle was so overloaded that it would draw the attention of a passing patrol, or, worse, break down in the middle of a high-stakes escape. They packed the interior of the vans from floor to ceiling, leaving barely enough room for the drivers to sit, the stacks of Benjamins pressing against the glass of the windows like a silent, green insulation. The coordination required for this transport was a masterpiece of clandestine logistics. In a city where every intersection could host a checkpoint and every shadow could hide a militia patrol, moving 3 tons of American currency was like trying to move a whale through a coral reef. They had to account for the physical space each bag occupied and the time it took for a human being to walk from the vault to the curb and back again. The guards likely used rolling carts, the small wheels clicking sharply over the tile floors, a sound that must have felt like a drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the bank. Every movement was a calculated risk. The air in the lobby grew thick with the smell of diesel fumes wafting in from the alley and the salt of human exertion. They were moving the equivalent of a small house's weight in paper, and the sheer absurdity of it must have been palpable. There is a specific kind of tension that comes from handling that much physical wealth, a feeling that the money itself has a gravity, pulling at the air around it, making the atmosphere heavy and hard to breathe. They were not just moving currency. They were moving power in its most raw, concentrated, and heavy form. And the logistics of that power required every ounce of their focus and strength. Finally, the last of the $282 million was loaded. The doors of the transport vehicles were pulled shut with a final, echoing thud that signaled the end of the first phase and the beginning of the most dangerous journey of their lives. As the drivers shifted into gear, they could feel the difference in the way the vehicles handled. The steering felt sluggish, the brakes required more pressure, and the engines worked harder to move the immense cargo. They pulled out into the dust-choked streets of Baghdad, the wheels kicking up a fine grit that shimmered in the amber glow of the streetlights. The city was a landscape of concrete barriers and rusted rebar, a place where the infrastructure was as broken as the peace. Every pothole in the road was a threat. A sudden jolt could shift the tons of cash, potentially unbalancing the vehicle or causing a tire to blow under the extreme pressure. They drove slowly, their eyes darting to every corner, every parked car, and every silhouette in a doorway. The weight in the back was a constant reminder of their success and their vulnerability. They were ghosts moving through a graveyard, carrying a treasure that could fund an army or rebuild a neighborhood, all hidden behind the nondescript metal of a few vans, creeping through the night toward a destination that remained a mystery to the world at large. As they navigated the winding streets of the Karada district, the sensory experience of the heist shifted from the tactile labor of the vault to the psychological pressure of the open road. The smell of the money was replaced by the scent of the city, charred wood, exhaust, and the faint, sweet aroma of jasmine that sometimes drifted over the walls of private gardens. The three guards, now passengers in their own getaway, sat atop millions of dollars, their bodies vibrating with the movement of the vehicles. They passed through the darkness, skirting the edges of the high-security zones, their hearts syncopated with the dull thrum of the tires on the asphalt. The logistics were now a matter of timing and nerves. Every minute they remained on the road was another minute for the weight of the 3 tons to betray them. The sheer scale of what they had done, moving the largest cash haul in history through a war zone, was a feat of dark brilliance. It wasn't just about the theft. It was about the mastery of the physical world, the ability to take something so immense and make it vanish into the labyrinth of Baghdad. The silence of the night was their only ally as they moved further away from the bank, the sagging vehicles carrying the weight of $282 million into the deepening shadows of the Iraqi dawn. The sensory experience of the heist shifted from the tactile labor of the vault to the heavy, oscillating vibration of a getaway vehicle burdened by impossible weight. As the tires hummed against the uneven asphalt of the Karada district, the 3 guards sat in the thick, humid silence of the pre-dawn hour. The air inside the cabin was stale, tasting of cold sweat and the metallic tang of ink from thousands upon thousands of freshly minted $100 bills. Every turn of the steering wheel felt sluggish, the suspension of the truck groaning under the pressure of nearly 3 tons of paper currency. In the distance, the first low light of July 12, 2007, began to bleed across the horizon, painting the Tigris River in shades of bruised purple and dull copper. The city was beginning to stir, but for the men in the truck, the world had narrowed down to the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the terrifying reality of what they carried. They moved through the labyrinthine streets like a ghost ship, passing the dark skeletons of bombed-out buildings and the flickering yellow glow of street lamps that hummed with the buzz of desert insects. When the morning sun finally crested the rooftops, it brought with it a heat that felt physical, a shimmering veil that distorted the air. At the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank, the manager arrived as he did every other day, the soles of his shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble of the lobby. The building was unnervingly quiet. Usually, the morning air would be filled with the low murmur of the night guards exchanging stories or the clatter of a tea kettle in the back room. Instead, there was only the persistent, rhythmic drone of the ceiling fans. As he moved toward the vault, he noticed the heavy steel door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peering out from the heavy frame. The silence in that moment was absolute, thick enough to swallow the sound of his own breathing. When he finally pulled the door back, the groan of the hinges sounded like a scream in the vacuum of the bank. The shelves, which only hours before had been stacked high with $282 million, were stripped bare. Only a few stray Iraqi dinar notes remained, fluttering on the floor in the draft of the open door like fallen leaves in an abandoned forest. The investigation that followed was a slow, agonizing descent into a bureaucratic fog. Officials from the Iraqi Interior Ministry arrived, their heavy boots echoing through the hollowed-out bank. They brought with them the scent of old cigarettes and the sharp, chemical odor of ink-stained fingerprint kits. They sat in the small, cramped offices, surrounded by mountains of paper ledgers that seemed to crumble under the touch of the humid air. The investigators ran their fingers over the bank's registries, searching for a name, a shadow, a mistake. But the three guards had vanished as if they had never existed at all. Their personnel files were thin, containing only blurred photographs and addresses that led to nowhere. One investigator, his brow slick with perspiration, stared at the empty vault for hours, trying to reconcile the mathematics of the crime. To move 3 tons of cash, 6,000 pounds of paper, through a city riddled with checkpoints and military blockades required more than just luck. It required an invisibility that could only be bought with the very money that was now gone. In the dusty suburbs of Baghdad, the police raided the small, unassuming houses where the guards had lived. The air in these homes was stagnant, smelling of unwashed tea glasses and the dry, earthy scent of the desert wind. In one house, a meal sat half-eaten on a low table, the rice hardened into white pebbles, a silent testament to a life abandoned in an instant. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic packing. It was as if the men had simply stepped out for a moment and dissolved into the golden haze of the afternoon. The investigators moved through the rooms with a sense of futility, their hands brushing against the rough texture of woven rugs and the cool, damp surfaces of tiled walls. They found empty closets and drawers left hanging open like gasping mouths. Neighbors spoke in hushed, frightened tones, their eyes darting to the shadows of the street. They remembered the guards as quiet men, shadows who kept to themselves, but no one could say where they had gone or who might have been waiting for them in the dark. The paper trail was not just cold. It was evaporating into the scorching heat of the Iraqi summer. As the days stretched into weeks, the rumors began to take root in the tea houses and markets of the city. Some said the guards had fled north, toward the rugged, wind-swept mountains of Kurdistan, where the money could be hidden in deep limestone caves. Others whispered that they had crossed the border into Syria or Iran, hidden under the floorboards of produce trucks that smelled of diesel and overripe fruit. The sheer logistics of the heist became a campfire story, a tale of a phantom convoy that moved through the heart of a war zone without a single soldier or policeman noticing. How does one move more than $250 million past the eyes of a dozen different militias? The answer, many suspected, lay in the silence of the officials themselves. The investigation hit wall after wall, as files went missing and witnesses suddenly developed a profound and sudden amnesia. The paper trail, once a clear path of signatures and dates, became a tangled web of contradictions. Every lead was a dead end, every suspect a ghost, and the missing 3 tons of cash became a weight that the city of Baghdad simply learned to carry in its peripheral vision. By the end of the year, the official reports began to gather dust in the basement of the ministry. The ink on the warrants faded from black to a dull, charcoal gray. The Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank eventually reopened its doors, but the air inside remained heavy, as if the vacuum left by the missing millions had never been truly filled. The 3 guards became legends, figures of myth who had managed to steal a fortune and walk through walls of steel and fire. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the narrow alleys of Karata, the locals still talk about the truck that groaned under the weight of a king's ransom. They wonder if the money is still out there, buried beneath the shifting sands of the desert or hidden in plain sight within the soaring towers of a foreign city. But the paper trail remains frozen in time, a collection of empty folders and silent photographs. The investigation did not end with a gavel or a confession. It ended with the slow, inevitable creep of the desert dust, covering the truth until it was indistinguishable from the ground beneath their feet. The silence of the vault had finally won. The sun over the Karata district in Baghdad does not simply rise. It heavy-handedly claims the city, baking the concrete and the stone until the air itself feels thick with the scent of sun-scorched earth and ancient dust. In the years following 2007, the physical structure of the Dar Es Salaam Investment Bank became a monument to a silence that no investigation could break. If you were to walk those streets today, you might still feel the phantom heat radiating from the walls that once housed $282 million in American currency. The building stood as a silent witness to the night when the very men sworn to protect it became the architects of its ruin. There is a specific kind of stillness in a place where such a massive vacuum of wealth was created overnight. It is the stillness of a held breath, the quiet of a desert that has swallowed a secret whole and refuses to offer even a whisper of its whereabouts. The neighborhood of Karata, once a bustling hub of commerce and survival, carried the memory of that July morning like a lingering fever, one that never truly broke even as the years turned into a decade and more. Imagine, if you will, the 3 guards on that fateful night of July 11th. These were men who lived within the bank, sleeping in the quiet, climate-controlled corridors, while the world outside struggled with the chaos of war. The air inside would have been cool, smelling of ozone and the faint, metallic tang of the heavy vault doors. When they moved to drain the coffers, they did not use explosives or force. There was no shattering of glass, no high-pitched alarms to pierce the heavy Iraqi night. Instead, there was only the soft, rhythmic shuffling of leather boots on polished marble, and the dull, heavy thud of canvas bags being filled with stacks of $100 bills. Each bag would have felt incredibly heavy, a physical weight that represented thousands of lives worth of savings and security. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, opening doors that should have been locked and passing through gates that should have been barred. The sheer volume of the cash, totaling $282 million and another 220 million Iraqi dinars, would have required a calculated, steady effort to move. It was a heist performed in a whisper, a vanishing act that left only the scent of empty air and the hollow ring of an unlocked safe. When the bank managers arrived on Wednesday morning, the humidity was already beginning to climb, clinging to their clothes as they stepped from the bright, harsh light of the street into the relative gloom of the lobby. The silence they encountered was not the respectful quiet of a professional institution, but the heavy, unnatural silence of an abandoned tomb. The front doors, usually secured with multiple layers of defense, stood slightly ajar, inviting the hot desert wind to swirl inside, carrying with it the fine, yellow grit of the Baghdad streets. As they walked toward the vault, their footsteps echoed with a hollow, lonely sound. The sight that met them was impossible to process at first. A vault door swung wide, its complex inner mechanisms exposed and useless, and the vast, cavernous interior stripped of its treasure. There were no signs of a struggle. No spent casings, no broken locks, no smeared fingerprints. The 3 guards were simply gone. Their beds were empty, their personal effects vanished as if they had never existed at all. In their place was only a void that the Iraqi government, the police, and even international investigators could never hope to fill. The legacy of the Dar Es Salaam robbery is written in the fading ink of police files that have grown brittle with age. For years, officials spoke of checkpoints that must have been bypassed and militias that must have provided cover for the escape. They speculated on how 3 men could transport such a literal mountain of paper through a city divided by concrete walls and armed patrols. Yet, the trail grew cold almost before it could be followed. The money did not resurface in local markets, nor did it cause a sudden ripple in the regional economy. It simply dissolved into the shadows of a country in turmoil. The bank itself, once a symbol of private investment and hope, struggled on for another 11 years, partially under the wing of international giants like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. But the stain of the 2007 heist remained indelible. By 2018, the institution finally closed its doors for good, the last of its financial statements becoming just more paper in the archives of a history that prefers to forget. The suspects, whose names were once whispered with a mixture of fear and awe, have become nothing more than names on old warrants, spectral figures who walked into the night and never stepped back into the light. As we look back at the echoes of this ghost, we find no closure, only the enduring mystery of the empty vault. The $282 million remains one of the largest unrecovered fortunes in the history of crime, a silent testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest secrets are those hidden in plain sight during the loudest of times. The sand has shifted over the tracks of those 3 guards, and the wind has carried away the scent of the ink. All that remains is the story, a soft narrative of a night when the guards of the treasure became its takers, and the city of Baghdad lost a piece of its future to the shadows. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.